We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, a hot topic that we have for you today. And I know you're excited to see what we're going to talk about. I have an expert on this topic in terms of Hebrew Bible and understanding what is the Bible talking about. And that is Idan Dershowitz. And he is a scholar. He's the chair of Hebrew Bible and its exegesis at the University of Potsdam, undergraduate and graduate training at the Hebrew University following several years of yeshiva study. Elected in 2017 to the Harvard Society of Fellows, he is the author of two books, The Dismembered Bible, Cutting and Pasting Scripture in Antiquity, and The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical book. I'm looking forward to reading both of these thoroughly. Go down in the description. Make sure you get a copy, because this is going to be one of those videos you're going to want to know. Does the Bible teach this? Is it condemning homosexuality? Well, he's currently studying the composition histories of Deuteronomy and the priestly corpus. For those who don't know, the documentary hypothesis has been on my mind a lot lately, because if we don't know that these are multiple sources that are compiled by some redactor who knows when, we might be stuck reading things like fundamentalist. Well, I know that carries over sometimes, but I was raised that way. That's not the kind of caliber we're dealing with today. So with that being said, welcome to the show, Idan Dershowitz. And I hope I get your name correct there as I go. My mind wants to say Eden, and it's like, no, it's not E-D-A-N or E-D-E-N. It's Idan. And so thank you so much.
Nailed it. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. I can't wait to see what you bring to the table here at MythVision. Also, a sister channel of ours, Digital Hammurabi, really good friend, Dr. Joshua Bowen, and his wonderful wife, Megan. They're looking forward to hopefully talking to you here in the near future. So straight out the gate, you wrote some hot, controversial stuff on the topic of homosexuality in the Bible. And I have to lay out the groundwork, if you don't mind. Many people who are definitely hardcore right wingers in America, for example, are using the Bible to slap people in the head that's their preference. That's their lifestyle. In fact, that's who they really believe they are. And their experience tells them that they're in love with the same sex. And they're looking to this ancient book and they're saying, I'm going to hit you in the head with it. And the other people are saying, I believe, I can't let this go. And they're justifying, well, it doesn't teach that. It's talking about something else. And sometimes I catch myself in the middle going, does it teach condemnation and death to a person who practices such things? Or is it really talking about that? And so today I brought you on so that you could take all the flack when things come flying. So anyways,
yeah.
Well, tell us about it, if you don't mind. What is the conflict?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the different positions that you presented are both true. And so the question is what we make of that. In other words, the Bible reflects different ideas, often contradictory ideas, and different people will focus on different things depending on, often on their, prior biases and so on. And there's a classic scene in The West Wing. I haven't seen it for more than a decade, but I remember, exactly on this, sort of issue where someone is citing the Bible, I think in the context, it might even be in the context of homosexuality. And then President Jed Bartlett retorts with, a whole series of other things that the Bible says are abominations. And, those are typically things that don't keep anyone, even fundamentalists, up at night. And so, the point being that the Bible's full of all sorts of things, and there's a tendency for people, really across the spectrum to cherry pick the things that most closely align with their ideologies. So, when it comes to the topic specifically of homosexuality, there's no question that there are passages that, could not be more explicit, like Leviticus 18, that, that really, make it clear that homosexual relations are, considered by that author to be abhorrent. But there are, other passages where the impression is very different. And I think, and this is something that I did in my research and my analysis of Leviticus 18, you can sometimes see even, development within a single text that changes, that reflects different opinions regarding this topic. And so I think that Leviticus 18 in its current form is extremely opposed to male homosexual intercourse. But an earlier iteration of the laws that are contained in Leviticus 18 might have had a different position.
If I may read this, I'm reading from the New English translation, which there's always a problem when you get to English and you're trying to read something. But this is why I love coming to you guys like you who are scholars to, if you will, break down this stuff so that simple minds such as myself can wrap our heads around it. So it says, you must not have sexual relations with a male as one has sexual relations with a woman. It is a detestable act. So just sticking with this one in particular, I know that you may not have your text right in front of you, but I'm sure you've heard it enough and had enough conflict on the internet to say, or in the world at large, to kind of like break down what's going on here. What does the earlier stuff say that maybe because before I let you run to this, I think it's important to say, why is this being said at all? Because humans have been practicing this as far back as we could possibly record and before that. So there's something, I think, innate in our natures as humans to do such acts or to have this kind of tendency. So this law would not be there if there weren't people who were probably doing these things. Anyways, what did the earlier forms maybe say?
So I think that the prohibitions against male homosexual intercourse that appear in this chapter, and it's worth noting that there are no prohibitions anywhere to be found in the Bible against female homosexual intercourse. So I think that they belong to a relatively late revision of the chapter, and I think that they go that this prohibition goes hand in hand with certain edits that we can perceive elsewhere in the same chapter in a list of forbidden sexual unions, like incestuous sexual unions. And so it's through an analysis of this seemingly irrelevant list of forbidden family members that we can see that there was that homosexuality was a key issue motivating the evolution of these laws. And I'd be very happy to explain that in more detail and get into the real meat of it.
Yeah, let's do that. Should I read the Leviticus 20 scenario? Or does this particular passage take the time? You're probably going to need to elucidate on this particular one, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Leviticus 20, I mean, it's also very relevant, and it sort of reflects the same sorts of things that we see here in Leviticus 18. So we can start with Leviticus 18 in any event. I'm going to open it up here in English as well.
Cool.
All right. So there's a unit of laws that appears from verse 6 in chapter 18, and it goes on to I'm gonna say it's hard to say where exactly it ends, but it continues at least to verse 17, and the general structure is the nakedness of so and so you shall not uncover, and then some sort of like further statement on that. So for example, it says in verse 10, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. And there are other ones, like it says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she has your mother's flesh. And this is the structure that repeats itself throughout the unit. And what I found fascinating when I read this is that there are two places in the unit where the sort of elaboration that appears after the prohibition, so after you shall not uncover the nakedness of so-and-so, it says something. There are two places where that something that it says fundamentally transforms our understanding of what we have just read. So in every other case, it doesn't really do much, but in two places, it completely transforms our understanding, right? So I'll just explain that. So, in the verse that I just read, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. So the statement for their nakedness is your own nakedness is neither here nor there. It gives us a little bit more information maybe, but it doesn't change anything about our understanding of what the actual prohibition is. But there are two places where you read the beginning of the verse and you're like, I understand what we're talking about. And then you read the end of the verse and you're like, wait a second, I must have misunderstood something. Mm-hmm. And those two verses have something in common. And that coincidence is the key to understanding what's going on here. So the first of the examples is the very first verse in this unit, where it says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother. So I'm reading it now. Let me just get the Hebrew. So I'll translate it literally. The nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. And that sounds, if we just read that much, the nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover, sounds like we're talking about the father and the mother. And this euphemism, we understand it to mean something like, don't have sexual intercourse. So it's as though it says, don't have sexual intercourse with your father or your mother. So far, so good.
Right.
Then you read the end of the sentence and it says, she is your mother. Do not uncover her nakedness. And so now you finish the sentence, you're like, wait a second, but what happened to the father? Didn't we just say the nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother? So what happened? So is it telling us that we're only talking about the mother? And if you look at, I have the New Revised Standard Translation in front of me, and they, in order to resolve this problem, they write, it's not the nakedness of your mother, the nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother, which is what it says in the Hebrew. They say, no, it's the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. Which is not in the Hebrew. The Hebrew just has a regular conjunction there, which, 99.9 something % of cases just means and. So this is one of the two places where the last few words in the sentence force us to say, I guess I misunderstood. In the beginning, I thought there was a prohibition against intercourse with both your father and your mother. But now I understand that I guess we were just talking about the mother. I must have misunderstood. Okay? That's one of the two. And then this happens one other time. It happens where it says, in verse 14, the nakedness of the brother of your father you shall not uncover. So you're like, okay, that's prohibiting intercourse with your paternal uncle. Got it. And then you read the clarification, and it says, do not approach his wife, for she is your aunt. And so again, you're like, okay, I thought it was saying don't have intercourse with your uncle. But I guess what it meant was that having intercourse with your aunt is like having intercourse with your uncle, or maybe this idiom of uncovering nakedness doesn't mean what it sounds like it means, and somehow, again, we end up with this clarification that, clarifies away a prohibition. And what if we look at these two cases together, we realize that in both cases, the clarification basically does away with a prohibition against male, homosexual, incestuous intercourse.
Incestuous, right.
So there was a prohibition against intercourse with your father, or maybe it means penetrating your father, whatever. We don't need to get into that. But there was a prohibition against some sort of intercourse with your father. In the first half, it sounded like. But then the second half is like, no. There's only a prohibition against your mother in this law, not your father. And then you thought that you were reading a prohibition against intercourse with your uncle, but then by the end of the verse, you're like, oh no, I misunderstood it. It just meant your aunt, actually. But in both cases, it seems like some editor is explaining away is basically deleting by means of clarification 2 prohibitions against intercourse with specific men. And then the question is, why would that be? Why would anyone feel motivated to say that there are no prohibitions against, incest with your father or your uncle?
Good question. Because it reminds me, and this is taking us elsewhere, and maybe this is part of a similar source. I don't know which source this might connect to, but it keeps reminding me about in the situation where Noah and his son, he uncovers his nakedness. Do you think that that's the most plausible way of reading this particular in light of this Leviticus law?
I mean, I have thoughts about that passage. It's a very, very tricky passage because on the one hand, when you look at it, even sometimes when it talks about like seeing nakedness, it sounds euphemistic, and other times it sounds like it's not euphemistic, or it sounds like it's talking about different things in different parts of the passage. Maybe we could, just for the viewers, quickly recap the passage that you're referring to. So there's, or do you want to do that? Go.
Sure. If I'm going wherever you're willing to go. I mean, I think it's relevant in a way. I mean,
yeah, and then we can swing back and draw some conclusions about Leviticus 18 after that. That sounds good.
Cool. So I think it's Genesis 11 or 10.
I think it's in 9.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So say verse 20, starting verse 21. Or start verse 20 even.
Okay. Are you wanting to read it, or?
I'm happy to go ahead. Sure. So Noah, man of the land, went and planted a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. So we have here an idiom that's similar to the idiom that we're discussing now in Leviticus 18, where it says here that Ham saw the nakedness of his father and then told his brothers. Then it continues and says, Shem and Japheth, his brothers, took a garment, they laid it on both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away and they did not see their father's nakedness. So up until now, it sort of sounds like everything's very literal. He just saw his father naked, told his siblings, and his siblings then covered him up, and then he was no longer naked. But then the next verse complicates that, because it says, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. He said, cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. And so you get the impression like something happened. And how could he know anything? I mean, if all of that happened was that his son saw him, there's nothing, that's not something that leaves any sort of evidence. And it's not really doing at all, and especially in light of passages like ours in Leviticus 18, where uncovering nakedness seems to be a euphemism for intercourse or sexual penetration or something like that. Some people understand that passage about Noah as referring to intercourse, perhaps. So, but as I mentioned, it's a very tricky passage because, depending on which verse you're reading, you get different impressions, and part of that might have something to do with the composition history of that text and the way that it evolved itself. But it's good that you brought that up, because it does. Give us some more information about this idiom and these ideas of uncovering and seeing nakedness as we have in Leviticus 18.
Yeah, that's been a mystery, that whole Noah thing for many.
Yeah.
They're kind of like scratching their head. I've heard from theories. So in Leviticus 18, it's not uncle, it's aunt. Wink, wink. It's not it's not dad, it's mom. Wink, wink. There's definitely something here. So when it gets to this passage in verse 20, I guess we could draw some conclusions. I'm sorry, not verse 20, verse 13. If a man goes to bed with a male as one goes to bed with a woman, the two of them have committed an abomination. They must be put to death. Their blood guilt is on themselves.
Right.
Is this factoring into the uncle, mother, father, uncle, aunt scenario?
Exactly. So here's the logical, like the full, train of thought. So we saw that we have these two places in this unit talking about forbidden incestuous unions, that it seems like someone is trying to delete, in a way, the prohibitions against intercourse between two men. And you'd have to ask yourself, well, why would anyone want to do that? I mean, especially if you are opposed to homosexual intercourse, what would possibly possess you to delete two prohibitions relating to homosexual intercourse? And the key to understanding that is a principle that is known as the exception proves the rule. But people use that term colloquially to mean like, oh, here's like a contradiction that doesn't really fit my theory, but it's only one exception. So the fact that it's just an exception supports the general principle. But that's actually not what the exception proves the rule means in the technical sense. In the technical sense, it means that the presence of an exception proves the existence of a rule. Okay, so if you were to see a sign that said no parking weekdays, you could infer from that parking is permitted on the weekends, even though it doesn't say that, right? So the fact that there's a specific prohibition against parking on weekdays tells you that there is a prohibition, a general prohibition. I'm getting the two sides of this confused. But if it says no parking from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., then you can infer that there is parking in the other hours. No parking on weekdays, you can infer that, right? So there's like a general thing and an exception. And so by a similar token, in our passage here in Leviticus 18, if there's a specific prohibition against sexual intercourse between a man and his father, someone could infer from that there is not a general prohibition against intercourse between any two men.
Good point. So simply put, if there's a clear, if it's going out of its way to say prohibition, as you say it, to make it simple. Oh, sorry, I'm not even on the screen yet. To make it simple. Do not sleep with your mother. Do not sleep with your aunt. Even if, let's go a step further and say what it's actually saying here. And also, don't sleep with your dad or your uncle. Got it. It's really going out of its way to say this, which is incestual. And then all of a sudden we get this verse that's going, a man sleeping in another man's bed, blah, 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 blah. Seems generic. It's out of context for the idea of incestual stuff. It doesn't seem like it's a prohibition against any and all things like this. Like you said, right. You can park from 8 to 8, but the other 8 to 8, it doesn't say you can't.
Exactly. Imagine you had two signs next to each other. One said, no parking 8 p.m., 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and the other says no parking anytime, right? There would be some sort of conflict between them. And right. So if you have two laws, one says no sex between men ever, and one says no sex between, closely related men, then there's some tension there. And so my interpretation of this tension within the individual verses where it says, don't uncover the nakedness of your father, actually, I mean just your mother. Don't uncover the nakedness of your uncle, actually, I mean your aunt. Like, the way I understand that is that someone was perturbed by the presence of specific prohibitions against intercourse between men. And they thought that could be read to mean that there's not a blanket prohibition against homosexual intercourse. And that's why they wanted to get rid of specifically these two prohibitions. And I think that interpretation is not unreasonable. In other words, if it's not the only possible way that you could read that list of incestuous unions, but it's a reasonable reading, and you can understand why someone, especially someone either the author of the prohibition against all intercourse between men, or someone who's read that and internalized that, you can see why they would want to make some changes to this list of incestuous unions. So the bottom line here is, at the very least, the editor of Leviticus 18, who put in those explanations to these laws that said, oh, you misunderstood the first half of the verse, we weren't actually prohibiting intercourse with that particular man. That person understood the initial law to sound like it was not prohibiting homosexual intercourse categorically.
Okay, yeah, that's where I was going with that. I thought that was interesting. If we could, and I don't want to shift topics unless you feel like we've adequately dealt with this particular one.
Go right ahead.
Okay, so Genesis 19 is quite an interesting place to start, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So everyone knows that Sodom and Gomorrah was full of homosexuals who were lust hungry for these foreigners who are passing through. They're strangers, really. They're deities, depending on who you're researching. They're Elohim. They're coming to see Lot and his family, and they're going to just sleep in the streets. And he's going, "Hey, dude, you don't want to do that." So I figure it might be good if I read this out loud for everyone. So 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening while Lot was sitting in the city gates, or the city's gateway. When Lot saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face toward the ground. He said, "Here, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house, stay the night and wash your feet. Then you can be on your way early in the morning." "No," they replied, "we will spend the night in the town square." But he urged them persistently, so they turned aside with him and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them, including bread baked without yeast, or unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they could lie down to sleep, all men, both young and old, from every part of the city of Sodom surrounded the house. They shouted to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can take carnal knowledge of them," is the way my translation has it, or "so that we may know them." Another one says, "so that we can have sex with them." It just depends on the English translation. Lot went outside to them, shutting the door behind him. He said, "No, my brothers, don't act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters, and anyone who wants to know, in antiquity, you were supposed to treat. So this is not something we should practice today, bottom line is. But in the ancient world, this is kind of the way things worked. So he says, "You can have my daughters and do with them as you please, but don't do this to these men. They're under my roof. They're under my protection." And anyways, I won't have to go any further with that one. I think everyone knows the gist of the story, but it sounds like they want to have sex with him, and they're lust hungry. Are these just a bunch of raving, lust crazy homosexuals, or are we missing the point?
Yeah, I think that actually we do often miss the point of that story. So, the term sodomy it comes from this story here, and I think that is already a certain, it reflects someone missing the point. It's interesting because in Talmudic terminology, to be a sodomite has totally different connotations of sort of it's more about being vindictively ungenerous, I guess. Which also comes up here in the same chapter, where you see that Lot is trying to be a good host, and right. So let's talk about that for a moment. So you have a bunch of people saying explicitly, or as explicitly as we could imagine, saying that they want to have intercourse with these men. Okay, so that's male homosexual intercourse. But then what does Lot say about that? What does the narrator say about that? What are we meant to make of that? And if the main issue here, if homosexual intercourse were this, were a prohibition and it were considered an abomination and so on, wouldn't you expect Lot to have said something like, "You sickos, what's wrong with you? What, you want to have sex with these men? Like, what's wrong with you?" Right? You could imagine him saying something like that, if sodomy is this abomination. But he doesn't say anything of the sort, right? He says, "No, these people are my guests. Here, I have 2 daughters. They're not my guests. They're my property, basically." That's the implication. So I have 2 virgin daughters. So you can do whatever you want with them, and I'm allowed to offer them to you because they belong to me. So obviously that's disturbing in a whole lot of ways.
Yeah.
As you suggested, and that and we can put that aside for the moment because we're not judging the morality of the text right now. We're just trying to understand. We're trying to understand it, and I think that it's reasonable to infer from the fact that the conversation never once, never once focuses on the homosexual nature of their desires. I think that it's quite likely that wasn't an issue. And, so it makes sense. Of course, his guests were men because you wouldn't expect women to go traveling from city to city. And it makes sense that he offered his daughters because his unmarried daughters are his property, and it's different. There are gender issues and all of these things. But the key here isn't it's okay for you to sleep with women. It's not okay for you to sleep with men. The point here is you want to mistreat my guests, and I won't have it. And so I think that this story, despite the fact that it's the source for the term sodomy, actually, if anything, tells us that the author of this text, or at least the characters in this text, don't perceive homosexual intercourse to be an abomination.
If I may press on getting because I love wanting to find out what it meant when it was written, divorce it from my own motives at that moment. Of course, I have bias. Like when I read this, I'm like, hell no. But that's a world we live in now. We have a different kind of way of viewing almost everything we're reading. So we have to be cautious and not judge. I mean, you can have your judgments of things after the fact, but I want to first know what was going on. And I'm glad society is the way it is. So the question is, when these men are being rude, they're ready to mistreat his guests. In what way do you think that was happening? Like, give us your guests so that we may know them. It does sound like in that instance that there is some type of sexual activity, if you take the word "no" to imply that. And I guess what is the sin here? It obviously, with what you're saying, it doesn't demand sexual intercourse with men. It doesn't. That's not what it demands at all. It seems to be a disrespect toward the guests. Like they're all ready to come over and do that.
Right, but let me just clarify. I mean, I while I think that the issue here is this, fundamental disrespect and mistreatment of the guests, I think that the way that manifests in this case is sexually. In other words, they're saying basically, we want to rape your guests, but what Lot is saying isn't like, it's not rape is bad. First of all,
wow,
it's not that that homosexuality is bad, or that homosexual intercourse specifically is bad. It's that these people are my guests. You will not mistreat them. I mean, let's read the passage, right? In verse 7, Lot says, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." So he feels like he has a moral obligation to protect his guests. And that's what's motivating him here. And the people of Sodom are portrayed as these, they're portrayed as barbarians who, and so on. But the root, or the central problem with their behavior, at least in the eyes of Lot, is that they are
demanding
demanding to do something to his guests. That's the issue. It's not gender. It's not the lack of consent.
I also have a huge red flag as to why what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And I mean, this is me maybe anachronistically projecting my own morals, but let's try not to do that. Like you talk about the whole mother-father thing, right? Mm-hmm. Well, right in the same story, as soon as they're destroyed, here he is with his 2 daughters. So it's like, and they don't, you know what always got me as a Christian fundamentalist was like, I would always like, couldn't see how the Bible didn't condemn that. Like it never was like, I can't believe you lied. Like an angel didn't appear and go, no, don't worry. We'll miraculously have your daughters have babies. Like, no, like they get him drunk. They go into their father. It's like they take turns each night doing this. And it just is like, what the heck? And it never condemned it. So if that's going on and it's not really saying, oh, I can't believe you slept with your 2 daughters, then what you're saying it could make a lot of sense as to why it's like not condemning, like, oh, I can't believe a man would want to sleep with other men. No, it seems like there's this guest and being rude, and you're literally crossing boundaries about how a righteous man should treat his guest. That seems to be the moral of the story, is like how you should protect your guest. It seems that might be it, more so than when you go into a city and everyone wants to have sex with your guest. Those horrible lusters. It doesn't seem that that's the point. Right.
Yeah, and there's no question that story about his daughters is something that makes a lot of sense to read in the light of the passage that we just read. Some people see it as a sort of either personal or divine retribution for what for what Lot was offering to do here. Whether or not that's the case is maybe beyond the scope of our conversation now, and I'm not sure that I have a completely confident view about that. But it's interesting, just that passage about the 2 daughters of Lot becoming pregnant from their father. It's interesting in the light of the passage that we read earlier in about Noah and his sons, because in both cases we have wine and potentially intercourse take place that is in some sort of haze. That right. So we have, if we understand that what happened in the story of Ham is not just seeing, but perhaps intercourse, then it's interesting to read that in the light of this passage about the 2 daughters, because maybe there's some sort of motif that drinking wine leads to bad sexual things taking place. So
that's an interesting point, and I've also heard it said, maybe you can tell me your thoughts of this, that we have multiple source material here. Potentially, this might be some tradition of an end of the world idea. I throw that out there to say because Lot did, like, after this happens, they think there's no one else out there. It sounds like in the narrative, just like Noah has to start over and repopulate the earth. It sounds like this is a repopulation, and it's like a last straw scenario. My daughters must have my children because this is the end of that world, and we've got to repopulate the earth. I've heard this saying before. The strange thing is it's by fire instead of water. But there seems to be a motif even through the Pentateuch. If you look at some of these sources, how does Israel come out of the Exodus? Cloud by day and fire by night. Like, it makes me kind of wonder, just thinking about it, if there's this motif, and if this is just another tradition that the redactors made narrative forms of, showing common themes like you're talking about. And this is just a different destruction, so to speak. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's explicit in this story of Lot's daughters that, like, they're motivated by a desire to repopulate the earth. It's just like we're meant to understand that they were just wrong. It's a funny thing. It's like, oh, they didn't realize that actually the whole world wasn't destroyed, But the story seems to be serving a few different purposes at once, and that's why it's really tricky, because it's also an etiology. In other words, it's a story that explains the names of two nations. There are two nations, Ammon and Moab, and this story is, it explains that the name Moab means from father. So like the daughter slept with her father, and that's why they're called Moab, right? And so the story's serving a lot of different purposes, and so it's a very rich and complex little narrative.
Yeah, why didn't you guys just walk a couple hundred yards in the opposite direction and find out Abraham's right down the street, and then you're all good? No, it's funny. It's an interesting narrative. Our final point of reference we've already touched on is the whole Leviticus 20:13. Mm-hmm. And how would you deal with that? Since Leviticus 18 is clearly indicating father, mother, aunt, and uncle, what is going on in Leviticus 20? So someone might go, yeah, but you try to get out of that one, I'm just being funny when I say it. But Leviticus 20 verse 13 says, if a man goes to bed with a male as one goes to bed with a woman, the two of them have committed an abomination. They must be put to death. Their blood guilt is on themselves. And this is where, like, you have these fundamentalists with radical signposts on the side of the roads who are saying, like, homosexuality deserves death and punish. Like, they really want to see people who are gay die. And that's horrible. But yeah, if you don't mind.
Look, so it is unambiguous, right? There's no question that, and some people have tried to interpret this verse in a way that, means something other than, the practitioners of male homosexual intercourse should be put to death. But it's inescapable, in my opinion. And, that's something that's in the Bible that really conflicts with modern ideas of morality held by, let's say, most enlightened, by enlightened people. So this is just like Leviticus 18:22, which also is unambiguous in saying that male homosexual intercourse is an abomination. Here we have, even one step beyond that. It's telling us not only that it's an abomination, it says almost the exact same words. It is an abomination, and also they should both be put to death. So this is a verse prohibiting male homosexual intercourse, calling it an abomination, and saying that it's punishable by death. Both, even if it means, even if lying with another man refers to one of the two parties, it doesn't matter, because it says explicitly that both of them shall be put to death. And so this is what I was referring to in the beginning when I was saying that the Bible contains many different ideas, sometimes contradictory ideas, and in this case, I think that we see on the one hand, in these verses, a prohibition against male homosexual intercourse and the expression of the idea that this is a capital offense. Elsewhere, we get the impression that different biblical authors thought other things. And I don't think that we can say, that we shouldn't erase either of these. We should be aware of them. And we should say, look, the Bible contains this thing, and it contains this other thing, and it contains these contradictory things. And as long as we don't just read the Bible and, take whatever verse we find as the Gospels, so to speak, as something that that we need to act upon today, then that's okay. These are historical texts, and they were written by multiple authors who had different ideas. So some people misinterpreted my analysis of Leviticus 18 as an attempt to say that the true Bible doesn't oppose homosexual intercourse. That I found like the real thing, and the thing that's like more holy or more, and that's not at all what what I think that I'm doing. I think that I was just showing that there are two different ideas that are reflected in the same chapter. And the earlier idea was that homosexual intercourse might not be an abomination. The later idea is that it is, and it's just two different ideas at two different points in Israelite history. And if it were flipped, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. Sometimes texts evolve in a direction that we today find lovely and reassuring. Sometimes they evolve in the opposite direction, and some people you can take from that whatever you want. But we shouldn't suppress the things that we don't like in the Bible. We should look at them, squarely and say, all right, well, here's something in the Bible that conflicts with my morality, and that's why I don't get my morality just uncritically from the Bible.
And that's a great point. I know early on you have a situation where you could own an Israelite even. And then later you're not allowed to, which is good. I mean, it's in a step in the right direction where it's like they're trying to do something. I mean, even the poor foreigners, poor strangers. But either way, the point is, it seems like they're starting to treat themselves a little better than they were already doing. Like, you could own an Israelite, now you can't. I think that's it's trying to go in a progressive way, and you got to give it some credit for it being as old as it is and in the ancient world. So I definitely do that. And I was going to say, there was one court case. I saw this on Facebook a while back. I couldn't find it. I was just going to pull it up, maybe show you. There's a lady debating this Southern, from the South in America. We've got some pretty hardcore fundamentalists, even in political power. And this guy is a judge. It looks like he's like a Supreme Court judge or something. And she's trying to explain homosexuality, like how you're trying to set up laws against them. Not that, like, this wasn't even a debate over, like, should they be allowed to marry and stuff. This is like it's illegal to practice that kind of stuff. And this is like in the 80s. And anyway, she goes, okay, well, let me play another scenario for you, Your Honor. Say a husband and a wife are in their own privacy of their bedroom, and he slips and it goes in the wrong hole. And he got all like intense, and he said that he better get his aim right. Like what? This is a husband and wife in their own privacy of their home, and you bet what, that guy probably is going to church that Sunday, listening to this stuff, and like, you get what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to knock the whole thing, but that, like you said, applying these things to our current context is just ridiculous, to be honest with you.
Right. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we need to look critically at the Bible, but not look at it like a monolith. We need to be aware of the different layers and the different voices. We need to be aware of the different interpretations throughout history. And then we can decide where we position ourselves, whether it's anywhere along these long and winding roads, or maybe not even, maybe we don't think that any of the positions that have been expressed at any point throughout biblical history and the history of its interpretation, appeal to us morally. And I think that's really the key. And sometimes the trend is, that things move in the right direction. Sometimes the trend is that things move in the wrong direction. Sometimes they move one way and then turn around, and we just need to look with clear eyes and see what's happening, and not just find a verse that, open the Bible, read a verse and say, okay, well, that's the truth.
Great point. And I think too often we've done that. So if you don't mind, explain to us real quick the Dismembered Bible, Cutting and Pasting Scripture in Antiquity. What is that book about? And then we'll ask about your second book. And then thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. My book, The Dismembered Bible, is about the methods of biblical editing in antiquity. So how did the Bible's editors work? And I'm looking at that question not just from the literary perspective. So, people for a long time have been talking about, different documents being combined and different, being compiled, or there being different layers and supplements and so on. That's a sort of literary perspective. And what I was very curious about was the material aspect. So let's say I'm an editor working in ancient Israel. How do I edit my text? So let's say I'm editing the flood story and I have two different versions of the flood narrative and I want to compile them. How do I do that? And you might imagine that the way that you do it is like any scribe. You have an empty scroll and you have a reed and ink and you're reading other scrolls and you're just copying a verse from here and a verse from there and you're writing a new text. And that's certainly something that's theoretically possible. But the conclusion that I drew in this book is that in many cases, including the flood narrative that I just mentioned, that does not appear to be how the Bible's editors worked, but rather they engaged in literal cut and paste. So the way I think that the flood narrative was edited is that there were two scrolls, each of which contained a version of the flood narrative, and someone cut them up with the knife and then assembled the different pieces of these two stories into a new narrative and then glued them on. And I think that one of the ways that we can infer this is that occasionally there are mistakes. People, no matter how careful you are, you're going to make mistakes. I just wrote these two books. I can tell you they're full of mistakes. As I'm a pretty pedantic guy, and I went over the text many, many times, but there are mistakes. And whenever someone makes a mistake, it's a clue, because different people make different mistakes in different circumstances. And so if I'm typing, I'll make one sort of mistake. And if I'm writing by hand, I'll make a different sort of mistake. And if I'm transcribing something that I hear, that can lead to a certain type of mistake, and so on. And I think that there are mistakes in the Bible that are characteristic of this method, cutting and pasting, and that are not easily explained as the outcome of a more sort of traditional scribal approach to editing. So that's that book.
That's awesome. So what about your The Valediction of Moses, a proto-biblical book? Can you tell us what that's about?
Yeah, sure. So that's something that's, I think, attracted even more controversy than my work on Leviticus 18. So The Valediction of Moses is the name that I've given to a literary work that is that appears in certain manuscript fragments that a man by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapira tried to sell to the British Museum and others in the 1800s. And these manuscript fragments were deemed forgeries at the time, and almost everyone since has considered them to be forgeries, and they've also, since that verdict, the actual manuscripts are lost. And what I argue in this book, and there's for those who are interested, if you Google The Valediction of Moses, I think you might find an article in the New York Times about this. I think that these manuscripts are not only authentic, but actually they contain something that we've never seen before, and that is a proto-biblical book. So these manuscripts contain some sort of text that looks a fair bit like the Book of Deuteronomy, but with all sorts of differences, and it's much shorter. Now, some people, whether they think it's real or fake, most people would say that this text is an abridgment of the Book of Deuteronomy. And in this book, I do a sort of philological analysis, among other things, of this text and compare it to the Book of Deuteronomy and to other parts of the Bible, and show, I think, that the Valediction of Moses, that these leather fragments that appeared in the 1800s actually contained an older version of the book of Deuteronomy that was actually quite radically different from the versions that we have in our Bibles. And so that's an extremely exciting thing, because, you know, we've never seen an earlier version, like a really dramatically different earlier version of a book or a source text. You know, you mentioned the documentary hypothesis, and so there are these ideas about different sources, and so this is like finding one of the sources of the Bible, or maybe without the like, it is that, I think. Ooh. So this is controversial, and some of my colleagues, you know, feel strongly one way, and others feel strongly the other way, and I imagine it'll take a little bit of time for the dust to settle, but if anyone's interested in reading that book, it's actually available for free as a PDF that's open access. So I encourage the viewers to download it and decide for themselves what they think.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful interview, and I'm super excited to hear what you guys think down below on this hot topic. As you know, it's a tough one, especially living in today's time where people are trying to keep the book. They want to believe every word that it says. They don't like to cherry pick, let's just say, which everybody does, no matter who you are, in some way, shape, or form. It seems like that. So make sure you guys drop a comment, go down in the description, get his books, and hopefully we can have more. Maybe have you come on and we could talk about some of your other works. Maybe after I've read some of this work, we could talk about piecing together, you know, how they did these things and get down into the nitty gritty. So
sounds great. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Patreon has all this stuff early, and we are MythVision.